In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Manor, a scream shatters the calm of a summer weekend. A journalist lies dead, his secrets spilled in a blood-stained notebook. Who struck the fatal blow in the rose-scented arbor? Was it the heiress with a hidden past, the doctor drowning in debt, or the solicitor guarding a fortune's secret? Enter Miss Jane Marple, her keen eyes piercing the lies of a glittering guest list. As clues unravel, a cufflink, a silk thread, a cryptic midnight pact, suspicion tightens like a noose. Can she unmask the killer before another secret claims a life? Dive into a classic mystery where every glance hides a truth and every truth hides a twist. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Blackthorn Manor. The late summer sun cast a golden haze over the rolling hills of Devon, where the village of St. Mary Mead nestled in its quiet, unassuming charm. The hedgerows were heavy with blackberries, and the air carried the faint sweetness of ripening fruit, mingling with the earthy scent of freshly cut grass. In the heart of the village, Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room at Dane Mead Cottage, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale pink shawl. Her eyes, bright and bird-like, darted occasionally to the window where the postman's bicycle wobbled along the lane. It was a Tuesday, the 12th of August, 1925, at precisely 11:30 in the morning when the letter arrived. Miss Marple, with her customary precision, noted the time as she opened the envelope, her fingers deft despite the faint tremor of age. The letter was written in an elegant, looping hand on thick cream paper, embossed with the crest of Blackthorn Manor, a grand estate some 20 miles north of St. Mary Mead. It was an invitation from Lady Beatrice Ashford, a widow of considerable wealth and repute, requesting Miss Marple's presence for a weekend gathering to celebrate the engagement of her nephew, Captain Lionel Ashford, to Miss Clara Wentworth, a young heiress of striking beauty and uncertain origins. "My dear Miss Marple," the letter began, "your reputation for discretion and insight precedes you. I should be most grateful if you would grace us with your company at Blackthorn Manor from the 15th to the 17th of August. A small, intimate party is planned, and I believe your presence would lend a certain equilibrium to our gathering." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Equilibrium. An odd choice of word, she thought, suggesting a balance in need of correction. She knew of Lady Ashford by reputation, a formidable woman, widowed young, who managed her late husband's estate with an iron Blackthorn Manor and a hired motor car, her modest suitcase stowed beside her. The manor stood at the end of a long gravel drive, its Georgian facade imposing yet elegant, with ivy climbing its honey-colored stone. The windows gleamed in the sunlight, and the gardens were a riot of roses and lavender, meticulously tended. Yet, as Miss Marple stepped from the car, she noted a certain stillness about the place, a hush that seemed to hold its breath. She was greeted by Lady Beatrice herself, a tall woman in her late 50s, dressed in a tailored navy dress with a string of pearls at her throat. Her graying hair was swept into a chignon, and her blue eyes, though courteous, held a flicker of calculation. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," Lady Beatrice said, her voice smooth as polished oak. "I trust the journey was not too taxing?" "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild but her gaze sharp. "The countryside is quite lovely at this time of year." They entered the grand hall, where a chandelier sparkled above a marble floor. The other guests were already assembled, sipping tea in the drawing room, and Lady Beatrice made introductions with practiced ease. Miss Marple, Ever observant, catalogued each face and mannerism, sensing the tensions that lay beneath their polite smiles. First was Captain Lionel Ashford, the groom-to-be, a handsome man of 32 with dark hair and a military bearing. His smile was charming, but his eyes darted nervously, as if expecting a reprimand. Beside him sat Clara Wentworth, his fiancée, a vision in pale green silk, her auburn hair cascading in soft waves. She was poised, yet her fingers twisted a lace handkerchief with a restlessness Miss Marple noted at once. Next was Dr. Henry Grayson, a local physician in his 40s, with a lean face and wire-rimmed spectacles. He spoke little, but his gaze lingered on Clara with an intensity that bordered on proprietary. His wife, Mrs. Evelyn Grayson, a faded beauty with tired eyes, sat stiffly beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Then there was Mr. Reginald Thorne, a solicitor from London, a stout man with a florid complexion and a habit of clearing his throat before speaking. He seemed overly attentive to Lady Beatrice, his compliments verging on obsequiousness. Miss Diana Prescott, a distant cousin of the Ashfords, was a sharp-featured woman in her 30s, her wit as cutting as her emerald brooch. She watched Clara with a barely concealed sneer, her lips curling as if she knew a secret. Finally, there was Mr. Victor Langston, a journalist of dubious repute, invited ostensibly to cover the engagement for a society column. His slick hair and sly smile suggested a man who traded in gossip as much as truth. He lounged in his chair, knitting needles clicking softly, her mind sifting through their words. She noted how Lionel avoided Clara's gaze when she spoke of their future, how Dr. Grayson's hand tightened on his teacup when Clara laughed, and how Diana Prescott's sharp retorts seemed aimed at wounding rather than amusing. As the afternoon wore on, Lady Beatrice led them on a tour of the manor's grounds. The rose garden was particularly splendid, its paths lined with blooms in every shade of red and pink. Yet Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small, secluded arbor, half hidden by a yew hedge. There she glimpsed Clara and Lionel in a heated exchange, their voices low but urgent. Clara's hand gestured sharply, and Lionel's shoulders slumped as he turned away. Miss Marple pretended to admire a nearby rose, her ears straining but catching only fragments. "Cannot go on like this." And, "You promised me." Dinner that evening was a formal affair, served in the oak-paneled dining room under the glow of candelabras. The menu was exquisite: consommé, roast pheasant, and a lemon soufflé. But the atmosphere was strained. Reginald Thorne dominated the conversation, recounting a tedious case from his practice, while Evelyn Grayson barely touched her food, her eyes fixed on her plate. Victor Langston, meanwhile, asked pointed questions about Clara's background, his tone teasing yet barbed. "Where did you say you were from, Miss Wentworth?" he asked, twirling his wine glass. "Somewhere exotic, I presume? Your accent has a certain indefinable quality." Clara flushed, her smile tight. "Oh, here and there," she replied vaguely. "My family traveled a great deal." Miss Marple, seated at the far end of the table, observed the exchange with interest. Clara's evasiveness was not lost on her, nor was the way Lionel's jaw tightened at Langston's probing. Lady Beatrice smoothly changed the subject, but the tension lingered, like a note played slightly off-key. As the meal concluded, Lady Beatrice rose, her expression unreadable. "I trust you will all sleep well," she said. "Tomorrow we shall celebrate Lionel and Clara's engagement with a small fete in the garden. Until then, good night." The guests dispersed to their rooms, their footsteps echoing in the vast halls. Miss Marple retired to her own chamber, a cozy room with a four-poster bed and a view of the moonlit gardens. She sat by the window, her knitting in her lap, and reflected on the day's observations. Blackthorn Manor was a beautiful place. But beauty, she knew, could mask the most dangerous secrets. The invitation had promised equilibrium, but what she sensed was a gathering storm. As she extinguished her lamp, a faint sound reached her ears,
a muffled sob, or perhaps a whispered argument from somewhere down the corridor. She could not be certain, but one thing was clear. The weekend at Blackthorn Manor would not pass without incident. Chapter 2.
Shadow Falls. The morning of August 16th, 1925, dawned crisp and clear at Blackthorn Manor, with a mist lingering over the Devon hills like a veil drawn across a secret. Miss Jane Marple rose early, as was her habit, and stood at her window, observing the grounds as the first light touched the dew-laden roses. The manor was silent, save for the distant clatter of servants preparing breakfast, but Miss Marple's thoughts were far from tranquil. The previous evening's undercurrents, Clara's evasiveness, Lionel's unease, the sharp glances exchanged across the dining table had settled in her mind like pieces of a puzzle, their edges not yet aligned. She dressed in her usual neat attire, a dove-grey dress with a lace collar and a simple brooch, before making her way downstairs. The breakfast room was bright, its tall windows admitting streams of sunlight that danced on the polished mahogany table. A sideboard groaned under silver dishes of kedgeree, kippers, and poached eggs, but only a few guests were present when Miss Marple entered at precisely 8 o'clock. Lady Beatrice Ashford presided over the table, her posture as impeccable as a navy silk morning dress. She greeted Miss Marple with a nod, her eyes briefly scanning the room as if counting heads. Dr. Henry Grayson was there, sipping coffee and reading a medical journal, his spectacles glinting in the light. His wife, Evelyn, sat beside him, her face pale and her fingers crumbling a piece of toast into fragments. Miss Diana Prescott, dressed in a tartan skirt and a crisp blouse, was buttering a scone with unnecessary vigor, her lips pursed in disapproval. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Lady Beatrice said, her voice carrying the faintest edge of strain. "I trust you slept well?" "Quite well, thank you," Miss Marple replied, taking a seat and accepting a cup of tea from a maid. Her eyes flicked to the empty chairs. "I see we are not all gathered yet." "Indeed," Lady Beatrice said, her smile tight. "Lionel and Clara are not early risers, it seems, and Mr. Langston and Mr. Thorne have yet to appear." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind noted the absence. She sipped her tea, observing the room's dynamics. Evelyn Grayson's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a cup, and Dr. Grayson, though absorbed in his journal, seemed to be listening to the silence rather than reading. Diana Prescott's sharp gaze darted toward the door each time a servant passed, as if expecting an interruption. The clock on the mantel struck 8:30, when a piercing scream shattered the morning's calm. It came from the direction of the gardens, high and frantic, and was followed by a shout and the sound of running feet. Lady Beatrice found Clara Wentworth standing in the rose garden, her face ashen, her green eyes wide with horror. She was clutching a shawl about her shoulders, her auburn hair dishevelled, and her gaze was fixed on a figure lying motionless beneath the yew hedge near the secluded arbour Miss Marple had noticed the previous day. It was Victor Langston, the journalist, his body sprawled unnaturally, his slick hair matted with blood. A heavy stone, stained dark, lay beside him, and his notebook was open a few feet away, its pages fluttering in the morning breeze. "Oh, heavens!" Evelyn Grayson gasped, clutching her husband's arm. "Is he—" Dr. Grayson knelt beside the body, his fingers probing for a pulse. After a moment, he looked up, his face grim. "He's dead," he said quietly. "A blow to the head, I'd wager. Quite recent, too, within the last hour or two." Lady Beatrice's hand went to her pearls, but her voice remained steady. "This is dreadful. We must send for the police at once. And Dr. Grayson, perhaps you could ensure nothing is disturbed?" "Of course," he replied, rising and adjusting his spectacles. "Though I'm no coroner, I can keep watch until they arrive." Miss Marple stood slightly apart, her eyes taking in every detail. The position of Langston's body, the angle of the stone, the scattered pages of the notebook. She noted the dew on the grass, undisturbed except for a narrow path leading from the arbor to the body, and a faint smear of mud on Clara's hem. Clara, still trembling, was now being comforted by Lionel, who had appeared from the house, his face pale and his military bearing faltering. "What happened, Clara?" Lionel asked, his voice low but urgent. "Why were you out here?" I couldn't sleep," Clara stammered, her eyes avoiding his. "I came for a walk, to clear my head, and then I saw him." She gestured toward Langston, her voice breaking. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was sharp. Clara's distress seemed genuine, yet there was a hesitancy in her words, as if she were choosing them with care. The old lady's eyes flicked to the arbor, where she noticed a crushed rose petal on the ground, its vibrant red stark against the green. Within the hour, the local police arrived, led by Inspector Hargreaves, a stout man with a bristling moustache and a no-nonsense demeanor. He surveyed the scene, barking orders to his constables to cordon off the area and take statements. Lady Beatrice, ever the gracious hostess, offered the drawing room for interviews, and the guests were ushered inside, their faces a mixture of shock and unease. Miss Marple lingered near the garden, her small figure unassuming as she examined the scene once more. Inspector Hargreaves approached her, his notebook in hand. "Miss Marple, is it? Lady Beatrice says you're something of an observer. Care to share any thoughts?" "Oh, I'm merely a visitor," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "But it does seem curious, doesn't it? Mr. Langston was a journalist, and journalists do have a way of stirring things up. I wonder what he might have written in that notebook of his." Hargreaves grunted, jotting down a note. "We'll look into it. For now, I'll need everyone's movements this morning. Can you account for yours?" "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "I was in my room until 8, then at breakfast with Lady Beatrice, Dr. Grayson, Mrs. Grayson, and Miss Prescott. I heard no one in the corridor before I came down." The inspector nodded, moving on to question the others. Miss Marple returned to the house, her mind turning over the details. Langston's death was no accident. The blow was too precise, the stone too conveniently placed. She thought of the tensions she had observed the previous day, Langston's probing questions, Clara's evasiveness, Lionel's unease, and that crushed rose petal, such a small thing, yet so suggestive. In the drawing room, the guests were subdued, their earlier politeness replaced by strained silence. Clara sat by a window, staring out at the gardens, while Lionel paced nearby, his hands clasped behind his back. Diana Prescott whispered something to Reginald Thorne, who nodded gravely, his florid face unusually pale. Evelyn Grayson clutched a handkerchief, her eyes red-rimmed, while Dr. Grayson stood by the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple took a seat near the tea tray, her knitting in her lap, and listened as Inspector Hargreaves began his interviews. Clara repeated her story of a sleepless night and a morning walk, her voice steadier now but still guarded. Lionel confirmed he had been in his room until he heard Clara's scream. Lady Beatrice stated she had been in her study, reviewing household accounts, while Dr. Grayson and Evelyn corroborated their presence at breakfast. Diana Prescott claimed to have been writing letters in her room, and Reginald Thorne said he had been delayed by a late night, only joining the others after the scream. Each alibi was tidy, yet Miss Marple sensed gaps, moments unaccounted for, glances that lingered too long. She thought of her own village, St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid behind lace curtains and polite smiles. Blackthorn Manor was no different, she mused, only grander in scale. As the inspector continued his questions, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes missing nothing. The murder of Victor Langston was a dark thread in the tapestry of the weekend, and she was determined to unravel it, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Insight. The morning's tragedy at Blackthorn Manor had cast a pall over the grand estate, and by midday on August 16th, 1925, the air inside the drawing room was thick with unease. The guests confined to the house while Inspector Hard's rustle of newspapers. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, appeared absorbed in her knitting, but her bright eyes missed nothing. The delicate click of her needles provided a steady rhythm against the undercurrent of tension, as she observed the subtle shifts in posture and expression among the assembled company. Inspector Hargreaves had taken over the library as his base of operations, and his constables moved to and fro, carrying notebooks and whispered instructions. The body of Victor Langston had been removed to the local morgue, but the image of his crumpled form beneath the yew hedge lingered in the minds of all. Miss Marple, though not officially involved, had been invited by Lady Beatrice to remain in the drawing-room, a gesture that suggested the hostess valued her quiet perceptiveness more than she let on. Lady Beatrice herself stood by the window, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze fixed on the gardens where the tragedy had unfolded. Her composure was admirable, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her fingers, and the way her eyes darted toward Clara Wentworth, who sat pale and silent on a velvet settee. Lionel Ashford hovered nearby, his attempts at reassurance clumsy, his own face drawn with worry. Dr. Henry Grayson and his wife Evelyn occupied a corner, their heads bent in low conversation, while Diana Prescott flipped through a magazine with an air of forced indifference. Reginald Thorne, the solicitor, mopped his brow with a handkerchief, his usual verbosity subdued. It was at 12:30 that Miss Marple's presence took on a new significance. Inspector Hargreaves, emerging from the library with a furrowed brow, approached Lady Beatrice and spoke in a low voice. Miss Marple, with her keen hearing, caught fragments of their exchange. "Langston's notebook, troubling entries. Need someone discreet." Lady Beatrice's eyes flickered toward Miss Marple. She beckoned her over. "Miss Marple," Lady Beatrice said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "The inspector has a matter that requires a delicate perspective. Would you be so kind as to assist?" Miss Marple set down her knitting, her expression one of mild surprise. "I am no detective, Lady Beatrice," she said. "Merely an old woman who notices things. But if I can be of help, I shall do my best." Hargreaves, though initially skeptical, seemed relieved to have an ally. He led Miss Marple to the library, where Langston's notebook lay open on a mahogany desk, its pages marked with hurried scrawls. "We found this near the body," he explained. "It's a mix of society gossip and something more pointed. Langston was digging into the backgrounds of several guests, particularly Miss Wentworth. There's a note here, CW not who she seems. Check records, Liverpool, 1922. Any thoughts?" Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and leaned over the notebook, her docket shared, eyes scanning the cramped handwriting. The entries were a jumble of observations. Clara's vague answers about her past, Lionel's financial troubles, a cryptic reference to Dr. Grayson's late-night consultations, and a mention of Diana Prescott's vendetta. One phrase stood out, underlined twice. The Pact at midnight. "It is curious," Miss Marple murmured, "that a man so interested in secrets should meet such an end. This notebook, Inspector, is a map of motives. But one must tread carefully. Gossip is a dangerous thing, and not all of it is true." Hargreaves nodded, his moustache twitching. "I'll have my men look into Liverpool, but I'd appreciate your take on the household. You've a reputation, Miss Marple, for seeing what others miss." She smiled faintly, returning to the drawing room with the notebook's contents fixed in her mind. The phrase, "the Pact at midnight," echoed, suggesting a clandestine agreement, perhaps overheard or uncovered by Langston's prying. She resumed her seat, her knitting needles resuming their rhythm, and turned her attention to the guests. Clara Wentworth was the first to be called for a second interview with Hargreaves, and Miss Marple watched her departure with interest. Clara's movements were graceful, but there was a stiffness in her shoulders, as if she carried a weight she dared not share. When she returned, her face was even paler, and she avoided Lionel's anxious gaze, instead taking up a book and pretending to read. Lionel, meanwhile, seemed increasingly restless. He approached Miss Marple, his voice low. "Miss Marple, you've seen a thing or two, haven't you? Clara's terribly shaken. She didn't know Langston well, but his questions last night upset her. Do you think... could this be connected?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her tone was measured. "Everything is connected, Captain Ashford, in a place like this. A man like Mr. Langston makes enemies easily. But it is the why and the how that matter. Tell me, were you in the gardens this morning before the scream?" Lionel flushed, his hands clenching. "No, I was in my room, as I told the inspector. I only came out when I heard Clara cry out. Why do you ask?" "Oh, million-old woman's curiosity," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. But she noted the quickness of his denial, the way his eyes slid away from hers. As the afternoon wore on, the inspector interviewed each guest again, his questions sharper now, probing alibis and relationships with Langston. Miss Marple listened from her corner, piecing together the timeline. Clara had been in the gardens at around 7:30, she claimed, alone. Lionel had been in his room until 8. Lady Beatrice had been in her study from 6 until breakfast. Dr. Grayson and Evelyn had been together in their room until joined. Thorne claimed he had overslept, only rising after the commotion. Yet Miss Marple's mind returned to the crushed rose petal she had seen near the arbour, and the smear of mud on Clara's hem. She thought, too, of the muffled sob she had heard the previous night somewhere in the corridor. The Manor's layout was clear in her mind. Clara's room was near her own, as was Lionel's, while the Graysons and Diana's were on the opposite wing. Thorne's room was closest to the stairs, and Lady Beatrice's was on the floor above. The arbour, secluded and shaded, was a place for secrets, a place where a pact might be made at midnight. She approached Lady Beatrice during a lull in the interviews, her manner unassuming. "The gardens are so lovely," she remarked. "That arbour in particular seems a place for quiet reflection. Do many guests wander there?" Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed slightly, but she answered smoothly. "It's a favourite spot for some. Clara enjoys it, I believe, and Lionel has been seen there. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason," Miss Marple said, her voice light. "It's only that such places often hold more than flowers." As the day drew to a close, the inspector announced that no one was to leave the manor until further notice. The guests retired to their rooms, their faces etched with strain. Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her knitting abandoned for a moment as she gazed out at the darkening gardens. The death of Victor Langston was no random act, she was certain. It was a calculated move, born of fear or desperation, and the key lay in the secrets he had uncovered. She thought of her own village, St. Mary Mead, where a careless word or a misstep could unravel a life. Blackthorn Manor was grander, its inhabitants wealthier, but human nature, she knew, was the same everywhere. Someone in this house had struck a fatal blow, and Miss Marple's little grey cells, as sharp as ever, were already at work, sifting through the clues to find the truth. Chapter 4. The Questions Deepen. By the afternoon of August 16, 1925, Blackthorn Manor seemed to shrink under the weight of suspicion, its grand halls and airy rooms now cloaked in a stifling atmosphere of distrust. The police presence, with constables stationed at the entrances and Inspector Hargreaves pacing the library, only heightened the sense of confinement. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner of the drawing-room, appeared as serene as ever, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on her pale pink shawl. Yet her bright bird-like eyes roamed the room,
catching every fleeting glance and nervous gesture among the guests. The interviews had continued through the morning, with Inspector Hargreaves growing increasingly brisk in his manner. He had questioned each guest about their movements between 6 and 8 that morning,
Committed to linger during these sessions, her presence unobtrusive, yet oddly reassuring to Lady Beatrice, who seemed to draw comfort from the old lady's calm demeanor. The inspector's focus had sharpened on Clara Wentworth, whose early morning walk in the gardens placed her near the scene of the crime. Miss Marple observed Clara closely as she returned from her latest interview, her auburn hair neatly pinned, but her green eyes shadowed with fatigue. She sat beside Lionel Ashford, who murmured words of comfort, though his own face was taut with strain. Miss Marple noted the way Clara's hand rested briefly on Lionel's before withdrawing, as if uncertain of its welcome. Hargreaves emerged from the library at 2 o'clock, his notebook bulging with notes. He addressed the group with a tone that brooked no nonsense. "I've spoken to each of you, and while your alibis are consistent, there are gaps. Mr. Langston was killed between 7 and 8 this morning, struck with a stone from the garden. Someone in this house knows more than they're saying. I'll be speaking to you all again, and I expect full cooperation." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Diana Prescott tossed her head, her emerald brooch glinting as she spoke. "This is absurd, Inspector. We're all respectable people. Surely you don't think one of us crept out to bash that dreadful man's head?" "Respectability," Hargreaves replied dryly, "is no proof of innocence. I'll need to see any correspondence or notes Mr. Langston may have left. And Miss Wentworth, I'd like another word about that walk of yours." Clara's cheeks flushed, but she nodded, rising to follow the inspector. Miss Marple's eyes followed her, noting the slight hitch in her step, as if she were steeling herself a battle. The old lady's mind returned to the notebook's cryptic entry, "C.W. not who she seems. Check records, Liverpool, 1922. And the underlined phrase, "the Pact at midnight." Clara's vague answers about her past were troubling, but Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen many a young woman hide a harmless secret, and many a guilty one wear innocence like a mask. As Clara disappeared into the library, Miss Marple turned her attention to the other guests. Dr. Henry Grayson sat with his medical journal, but his fingers tapped restlessly on the arm of his chair. Evelyn Grayson, beside him, was twisting her handkerchief into knots, her eyes darting toward the library door. Reginald Thorne, mopping his brow, muttered about the inconvenience of it all, while Diana Prescott's sharp tongue had fallen silent, her gaze fixed on Lionel with a mixture of pity and disdain. Miss Marple decided to take a small initiative. She approached Lady Beatrice, who stood by the tea tray, her hands arranging cups with unnecessary precision. "Such a trying day," Miss Marple said softly. "I wonder, Lady Beatrice, if
Mr. Langston had any particular reason to be in the garden so early. He struck me as a man more at home with a pen than with roses." Lady Beatrice's fingers paused, and her blue eyes met Miss Marple's with a flicker of wariness. "Victor was inquisitive," she said carefully. "He often wandered looking for stories. I suppose he may have been meeting someone, though I can't imagine who." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "The arbor is such a secluded spot. A place for private conversations, perhaps." Lady Beatrice's lips tightened, but she said nothing, turning to pour tea with a steady hand. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind sifting through possibilities. The arbor, with its crushed rose petal and narrow path of disturbed dew, was central to the mystery. She recalled the muffled sob from the previous night, and the heated exchange she had glimpsed between Clara and Lionel in that very spot. Had Langston overheard something he shouldn't have? Or had he arranged a meeting that turned deadly. When Clara returned from her interview, her composure was fraying. She sank onto the settee, her hands clasped tightly, and Lionel moved to her side, his voice low and urgent. "What did he ask you, Clara? You look dreadful." "It's nothing," Clara said, a voice barely above a whisper. "Just the same questions. Where I was, what I saw. I told him I walked alone, and then I found him." Her eyes flickered toward Miss Marple, who pretended to be absorbed in her knitting. Miss Marple, however, was listening intently. Clara's story was consistent, but consistency, she knew, could be rehearsed. She thought of the mud on Clara's hem, a detail the inspector had not yet mentioned. The gardens were dry, save for the dew, and the path to the arbor was gravel. Mud suggested another route, perhaps through the flower beds near the manor's west wing, where the soil was softer. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple took the opportunity to explore the manor's lower floor, her movements slow and unassuming. She paused by a French window that opened onto the gardens, noting its proximity to the west wing and the arbor beyond. The window's latch was loose, easily opened from either side, and a faint scuff mark on the sill caught her eye. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple had learned to trust small things. She made a mental note to ask the servants about the window's use. Returning to the drawing room, she found Inspector Hargreaves addressing the group once more. "We've searched Mr. Langston's room," he announced. "Found a letter, half-written, addressed to his editor. It mentions a scoop he was working on, something about a secret agreement that would shake the foundations of Blackthorn. Any of you know what he meant?"
Narrowed. Reginald Thorne cleared his throat, but said nothing, while Lady Beatrice's face remained impassive. "I see," Hargreaves said, his tone heavy with skepticism. "Well, we'll be checking alibis against the servant statements. And Miss Marple, if you notice anything unusual, I'd appreciate a word." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild. But her mind was racing, piecing together the fragments. The notebook, the letter, the crushed petal, the scuff mark, the mud. Langston had been a threat, his questions probing too deeply into secrets the guests wished to keep buried. The pact at midnight suggested a conspiracy. But between whom? And why had it led to murder? As the guests dispersed for a late luncheon, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the French window. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a misplaced word or a careless glance could unravel a carefully woven lie. Blackthorn Manor was no different, she mused, only its secrets were dressed in finer clothes. Someone had killed to protect their truth, and Miss Marple was determined to find out who. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The late afternoon sun of August 16th, 1925, bathed Blackthorn Manor in a warm, deceptive glow, as if the tragedy of Victor Langston's death could be softened by the beauty of the Devon countryside. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but serene. The guests, confined to the manor under Inspector Hargreaves' watchful eye, moved with the stiffness of actors in a play they had not rehearsed. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity, her needles clicking in a rhythm that seemed to measure the pulse of the house's unease. Inspector Hargreaves had intensified his investigation, his constables now combing through the servants' quarters and the manor's outbuildings. The discovery of Langston's half-written letter, hinting at a scoop that would shake the foundations of Blackthorn, had shifted suspicion onto the guests, particularly those named in his notebook. Clara Wentworth, with her vague past and early morning presence in the garden, was the most obvious suspect, and Hargreaves seemed determined to press her. Miss Marple, however, knew that the obvious was rarely the truth. In her experience in St. Mary Mead, the loudest clues often led to the wrong door. She watched as Clara, pale and withdrawn, sat by the window, her fingers twisting the lace of her handkerchief. Lionel Ashford hovered nearby, his attempts at reassurance increasingly strained. The other guests, Lady Beatrice, Dr. Henry Grayson, Evelyn Grayson, Diana Prescott, and Reginald Thorne, kept their distance, their polite facades cracking under the weight of suspicion. At 4 o'clock, Hargreaves summoned the group to the drawing room.
Cufflink, engraved with the initials L.A. This was found near the arbor, not far from where Langston was killed. Captain Ashford? Care to explain? Lionel's face drained of color, his military bearing faltering. That's mine, he admitted, his voice hoarse. But I haven't worn those cufflinks since last month. I thought they were in my room. Convenient, Hargreaves said, his tone dry. And yet here one is, near a murder scene. You were in your room all morning, you say? Yes, Lionel insisted, his eyes darting to Clara. I told you, I didn't go to the gardens until I heard Clara scream. Clara nodded faintly, but Miss Marple noted the hesitation in her eyes, as if she were weighing whether to confirm his story. The room buzzed with tension, and Diana Prescott's lips curled in a faint, mocking smile. Really, Lionel, she said, her voice sharp, you're not helping yourself. Those cufflinks are rather distinctive. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze resting on Diana. The young woman's tone was too gleeful, her accusation too quick. A red herring, perhaps, designed to divert attention? She thought of the cufflink's placement, near the arbor, but not so close as to be conclusive. It could have been dropped days ago, or deliberately placed to mislead. Hargreaves turned to Clara next. Miss Wentworth, you were in the gardens at 7:30. Did you see Captain Ashford or anyone else near the arbor? No, Clara said, her voice barely audible. I was alone. I saw no one until I found Mr. Langston. The inspector's eyes narrowed, but he let her go, moving on to question the others. Miss Marple listened carefully, noting inconsistencies. Dr. Grayson claimed he and Evelyn had been together in their room until breakfast, but Evelyn's nervous glance suggested otherwise. Reginald Thorne repeated his story of oversleeping, but his florid complexion and frequent throat clearing hinted at unease. Diana Prescott, with her sharp wit, insisted she had been writing letters, yet Miss Marple recalled no sound of a pen scratching from her room, which was near her own. After the interviews, Miss Marple slipped away to the library, where she had permission to examine Langston's notebook again. The pages were a tangle of gossip and conjecture, but one entry caught her eye. E.g., seen leaving West Wing, 1 a.m., night of 14th. E.g., Evelyn Grayson, perhaps? The West Wing housed the French window with a loose latch, and the scuff mark Miss Marple had noticed. Had Evelyn been meeting someone, or escaping an encounter? Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple approached Evelyn Grayson, who sat alone.
Evelyn's eyes widened, and her hands stilled.
I don't walk at night, she said quickly. I was in my room with Henry.
Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing, but she noted the flush creeping up Evelyn's neck, the way her eyes avoided contact. A lie, perhaps, or a half-truth. As evening approached, the guests gathered for a subdued dinner, the engagement fate now forgotten. Lady Beatrice maintained her composure, but her conversation was stilted, her eyes flicking toward Lionel and Clara. Miss Marple, seated beside Reginald Thorne, engaged him in light conversation about his legal practice, probing gently for insights. Mr. Langston was quite curious about the Ashford estate, wasn't he? she remarked. "I suppose he thought there was a story in it." Thorne cleared his throat, his face reddening. "He was a nuisance, always asking about trusts and inheritances. I told him it was none of his business." "Quite right," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. But she filed away his defensiveness, wondering what Langston had uncovered about the estate, or Thorne's role in it. After dinner, Miss Marple retired to her room, her mind buzzing with details. The cufflink, the notebook, the scuff mark, the mud on Clara's hem, Evelyn's nervousness. The cufflink pointed to Lionel, but its discovery felt staged, a distraction from the real truth. Langston's notes suggested multiple secrets: Clara's past, Evelyn's nocturnal wanderings, perhaps even Diana's vendetta, and the Pact at midnight loomed like a shadow, hinting at a conspiracy that had turned deadly. She sat by her window, gazing at the darkened gardens. The arbor, with its crushed rose petal, was the key, she was certain. It was a place of secrets, where words were whispered and promises made, or broken. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how a single misstep could unravel a life, and Blackthorn Manor was no different. Someone had placed that cufflink to mislead, just as someone had struck Langston to silence him. The question was not only who, but why. As she prepared for bed, a faint sound reached her ears, a creak, as if someone were moving stealthily along the corridor. She paused, her hand on the lamp, and listened. The sound stopped, then resumed, moving toward the west wing. Miss Marple made a mental note to check the French window again in the morning. For now, she extinguished her light, her mind as sharp as the stars outside, piecing together the puzzle of Blackthorn Manor. The morning of August 17th, 1925, broke with a heavy mist that clung to Blackthorn Manor, shrouding the gardens in a ghostly veil. The air was cool and the arbor beyond. The creak she had heard in the corridor the previous night lingered in her mind, a small but significant detail, like a single wrong note in a familiar tune. Dressed in her customary neat attire, a lavender skirt and a cream blouse with a cameo brooch, she made her way downstairs before breakfast, pausing at the French window in the west wing. The loose latch and scuff mark she had noted earlier were unchanged, but she observed something new. A faint thread of green silk caught on the window's edge, barely visible against the dark wood. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Green silk. Clara Wentworth had worn a green dress at dinner on the first night, and Evelyn Grayson owned a green shawl. A small clue, but in Miss Marple's experience, small clues were often the threads that unravelled the tightest knots. At breakfast, the mood was sombre. Lady Beatrice presided with her usual poise, but her eyes were shadowed, and her conversation was limited to polite inquiries about the guests' comfort. Lionel Ashford sat beside Clara, his face drawn, the discovery of his cufflink clearly weighing on him. Clara herself was silent, her auburn hair pinned tightly, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. Dr. Henry Grayson read his medical journal with forced concentration, while Evelyn, beside him, picked at her food, her hands trembling. Diana Prescott's sharp wit was muted, though her eyes darted around the table, as if searching for weakness. Reginald Thorne, usually voluble, spoke little, his florid face pale. Inspector Hargreaves joined them briefly, his moustache bristling as he announced that the coroner's preliminary report confirmed Langston's death as murder, a single, deliberate blow to the temple with the garden stone, delivered between 7 and 7:30 a.m. on August 16th. "We're waiting on more details," he said, "but I'll need to re-examine everyone's movements. And Captain Ashford, that cufflink is still a problem." Lionel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his eyes flicking to Clara. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the exchange, her mind turning to the cufflink's placement. Too convenient, too accusing. It was, she suspected, a deliberate misdirection. But by whom? After breakfast, Miss Marple took advantage of a moment's quiet to revisit the library where Langston's notebook remained under police supervision. With Hargreaves's permission, she examined it again, her eyes lingering on the entry about E.G. seen leaving West Wing 1 a.m., night of 14th. Another note caught her attention. R.T. evasive about trust, hidden beneficiary? Reginald Thorne, the solicitor, had been defensive when questioned about the Ashford estate. Could Langston have uncovered something about the family's finances, perhaps a secret that threatened Thorne's position? Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found the guests scattered, their nerves fraying under the strain of such
confinement. She approached Evelyn Grayson, who sat alone, a green shawl draped over her shoulders. "Mrs. Grayson," Miss Marple said gently, "I couldn't help but notice your lovely shawl. Such a delicate shade of green. Do you often wear it for evening walks?" Evelyn's eyes widened, and her fingers tightened on the fabric. No, I don't walk at night," she said, her voice unsteady. "I've been in my room with Henry every evening." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming, but the green thread on the window frame flashed in her mind, and she wondered what had drawn Evelyn or someone wearing her shawl to the West Wing in the early hours. Later, Miss Marple sought out Clara, who was standing by the French window gazing at the mist-shrouded gardens. "Miss Wentworth," she said softly, "the arbor must be a peaceful place in the mornings. Did you notice anything unusual there yesterday, before you found poor Mr. Langston? A sound, perhaps, or a glimpse of someone?" Clara's hand froze on the window frame, and her green eyes met Miss Marple's with a flicker of fear. "No," she said quickly. "It was quiet. Just the birds and the dew. I didn't see anyone until I found him." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but she noted the slight quiver in Clara's voice, the way her gaze darted away. The mud on Clara's hem, the green thread, the crushed rose petal, these were pieces of a puzzle, and Clara was at its center, whether by chance or design. As the day progressed, Hargreaves called the guests together again, his tone sharper now. "I've spoken to the servants," he said. "One of them, a maid named Polly, saw someone moving near the West Wing at around 7:15 yesterday morning. She couldn't identify them, too misty, but they were wearing dark clothing. Anyone care to explain?" The room fell silent, but Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Lionel, who had worn a dark jacket at breakfast yesterday, and to Dr. Grayson, whose medical bag often accompanied him in a dark overcoat. Diana Prescott spoke up, her voice cutting. "It could have been anyone, Inspector. The servants are hardly reliable in this fog." Hargreaves ignored her, his gaze fixed on Lionel. "Captain Ashford, your cufflink was found near the arbor. Now we have a figure in dark clothing. You're not making this easy for yourself." "I told you," Lionel said, his voice rising. "I was in my room. I didn't go near the arbor." Clara reached for his hand, but her touch was fleeting, and Miss Marple noted the strain between them. Something unspoken hung in the air, a secret perhaps, tied to Langston's note about the Pact at midnight. Miss Marple's mind returned to the arbor, the scene of the crime. The crushed rose petal, weapon of opportunity, but one chosen for its purpose. And the green thread, had it come from Clara's dress, Evelyn's shawl, or another source entirely? She approached Inspector Hargreaves later, her manner unassuming. "Inspector," she said, "have you considered the window in the West Wing? It's rather loose, and I noticed a thread caught on the frame. It might be nothing, but—" Hargreaves' eyes sharpened. "A thread, you say? We'll check it. You've a keen eye, Miss Marple." "It's only what anyone might notice," she replied modestly, but her mind was racing. The thread, the cufflink, the notebook. They were clues, not solutions, and the truth lay in their connections. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how a single detail, a misplaced letter, a glance too long, could reveal a hidden truth. Blackthorn Manor was no different, its elegance a facade for secrets that had turned deadly. As the mist thickened outside, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking like a metronome. The arbor, the midnight pact, the nervous glances. She was beginning to see the shape of the puzzle, though its pieces were not yet complete. Someone in this house had killed Victor Langston, and Miss Marple's little grey cells were working tirelessly to uncover why. Chapter 7. More lies surface. The mist that had cloaked Blackthorn Manor on the morning of August 17, 1925, began to lift by midday, revealing the gardens in sharp relief, as if the estate itself was shedding a veil to expose its secrets. Inside, the atmosphere remained heavy, the guests moving through the grand rooms with the wariness of chess pieces on a board where every move was scrutinized. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a familiar corner of the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking with unhurried precision, observed the shifting dynamics with her keen, bird-like eyes. The murder of Victor Langston had cracked the polished surface of the gathering, and beneath it, Miss Marple sensed a tangle of hidden affairs, financial motives, and bitter feuds waiting to be unraveled. Inspector Hargreaves, growing more dogged with each passing hour, had intensified his questioning, focusing on the green silk thread found on the French window's frame and the cufflink bearing Lionel Ashford's initials. The thread, he announced at luncheon, matched the fabric of Clara Wentworth's green dress from the first evening, though it could also have come from Evelyn Grayson's shawl. This revelation sent a ripple of tension through the group, with Clara's face paling and Evelyn's hands twisting her handkerchief into tighter knots. Miss Marple, sipping her soup with her usual composure, noted the reactions. Clara's eyes darted to Lionel, who sat rigidly beside her, his jaw set. Evelyn Grayson, seated across the table, avoided.
Thorn cleared his throat repeatedly, his florid complexion betraying his unease. Lady Beatrice, presiding over the meal, maintained her poise, but her eyes lingered on Clara with a scrutiny that Miss Marple found telling. After luncheon, the inspector called Clara for yet another interview, and Miss Marple, with Lady Beatrice's tacit approval, followed discreetly to the library. She stood just outside, her small figure unobtrusive, listening as Hargreaves pressed Clara about the thread.
"Miss Wentworth,"
he said, his voice stern,
"the thread matches your dress. You were in the gardens at the time of the murder, and now we find evidence linking you to the West Wing window. Can you explain?"
Clara's voice was low, strained.
I don't know how it got there. I haven't been near that window. I told you I was walking in the gardens near the arbor when I found Mr. Langston.
"And yet," Hargreaves said, "the thread suggests otherwise. And your past, Miss Wentworth. Langston's notebook mentions Liverpool, 1922. Care to elaborate?"
There was a long pause, and Miss Marple, her ear close to the door, could almost hear Clara's hesitation.
"There's nothing to tell,"
Clara said finally, her voice barely audible.
"I travelled with my family. We moved often. Mr. Langston was mistaken if he thought there was a story."
Miss Marple's lips pursed. Clara's evasiveness was a shield, but whether it protected innocence or guilt, she could not yet say. She returned to the drawing-room, her mind turning over the details, the thread, the cufflink, Langston's note about E.G. seen leaving West Wing, 1 a.m., and the cryptic Pact at midnight. Each clue pointed to a web of secrets, and Clara, it seemed, was at its center. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple sought out Evelyn Grayson, who was lingering in the conservatory,
her green shawl draped over a wicker chair. The room was filled with the scent of ferns and orchids, a humid contrast to the manor's austere elegance.
Mrs. Grayson,
Miss Marple said, her tone gentle.
you seem so fond of this shawl. Do you often wear it about the house? It's such a delicate fabric, easily caught on a latch or frame.
Evelyn's eyes widened, and her hands clutched the arms of her chair.
I don't wear it often.
She said, her voice trembling.
I was in my room that night, as I told you. I didn't go near the west wing.
Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. But she noted the flush creeping up Evelyn's neck, the way her eyes avoided contact. The green thread could belong to either Clara or Evelyn, but Evelyn's nervousness suggested a deeper secret. Had she been the E.G.
You're a fool, Reginald, if you think no one noticed your late-night meetings with Lady Beatrice. Langston did, and look where it got him. Thorne's reply was a low hiss. Keep your voice down, Diana. You've no proof, and your own secrets aren't so well hidden. Langston knew about your little scheme, didn't he? Miss Marple, pausing as if to adjust her shawl, filed away the conversation. Diana's vendetta, as Langston's notebook had called it, and Thorne's evasiveness about the estate, suggested financial motives, or perhaps something more personal. She thought of the Ashford estate, its wealth tied up in trusts and inheritances, and wondered what Langston had uncovered that made him a threat. At tea, the tension broke into open conflict. Diana, her composure fraying, made a barbed remark about Clara's mysterious origins, prompting Lionel to rise, his face flushed with anger. "That's enough, Diana," he snapped. "You've no right to speak of Clara that way." "Oh, don't I?" Diana retorted, her eyes glittering. "Langston thought otherwise, didn't he? He was sniffing around her past, and now he's dead. Convenient, isn't it?" Clara's teacup clattered to its saucer, and she rose, her voice shaking. "How dare you? I had nothing to do with his death." Lady Beatrice intervened, her voice like steel. "That will do, Diana. We are all under strain, but such accusations are unbecoming." Miss Marple watched the exchange, her mind cataloguing the emotions. Diana's malice, Lionel's protectiveness, Clara's fear. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a single careless word could reveal a feud or a betrayal. Here the stakes were higher, the secrets darker. Langston's notebook had hinted at financial irregularities, hidden relationships, and a mysterious pact. The cufflink pointed to Lionel, the thread to Clara or Evelyn. But Miss Marple suspected these were distractions, designed to obscure a deeper truth. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple approached Inspector Hargreaves, who was reviewing his notes in the library. "Inspector," she said, her voice mild, "have you considered the servants' movements? They have access to every part of the house, and a maid or footman might have seen something or someone near the west wing that night." Hargreaves nodded, jotting down a note. "Good point, Miss Marple. I've got Polly and the butler Jenkins lined up for another round of questions. You've a knack for this, haven't you?" "Oh, I merely notice things," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. But her mind was racing, piecing together the fragments, the thread, the cufflink, the notebook, the overheard argument. The lies were surfacing, each one a clue to the truth. Someone in Blackthorn Manor had killed to protect a secret, and Miss Marple's little grey cells were working tirelessly to 1925. Settled over Blackthorn Manor, with a quiet that felt more oppressive than serene, as if the very walls held their breath. The mist had cleared, leaving the gardens bathed in the soft glow of twilight. But within the manor, the atmosphere was charged with unspoken accusations and fraying nerves. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing room with her knitting, observed the guests with her characteristic calm, her bright eyes catching every flicker of emotion. The murder of Victor Langston had peeled back the veneer of civility, and now, as the investigation deepened, secrets were beginning to spill like ink from a broken pen. The day had been relentless, with Inspector Hargreaves pressing each guest for details about their movements and relationships with the deceased journalist. The green silk thread, the gold cufflink, and Langston's notebook had tightened the web of suspicion around Clara Wentworth and Lionel Ashford, but Miss Marple sensed that the truth lay deeper, tangled in the motives and fears of the entire household. The cryptic note about the Pact at midnight and the mention of E.G. seen leaving West Wing 1 a.m. gnawed at her, suggesting a conspiracy that had turned deadly. Dinner was a strained affair, the clink of cutlery against porcelain, the only sound breaking the silence. Lady Beatrice, presiding with her usual elegance, seemed distracted, her eyes lingering on Clara and Lionel, with a mixture of concern and calculation. Clara, pale and drawn, barely touched her food, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Lionel sat beside her, his military bearing eroded by tension, his gaze flickering toward the French window that led to the gardens. Dr. Henry Grayson and Evelyn sat in their customary corner, their faces masks of restraint, though Evelyn's hands trembled as she lifted her wineglass. Diana Prescott's sharp wit had dulled, her emerald brooch glinting as she watched the others, with narrowed eyes. Reginald Thorne, usually loquacious, ate in silence, his florid complexion betraying his unease. As the meal concluded, the tension broke. Evelyn Grayson, her nerves evidently stretched to their limit, set down her glass with a clatter and rose, her voice trembling but resolute. "I can't bear this any longer," she said, her eyes darting to her husband. "Henry, we must tell them. It's no use pretending. Langston knew, and it's why he's dead." The room froze, every head turning toward her. Dr. Grayson's face paled, his spectacles slipping slightly as he reached for her arm. "Evelyn, please," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," Evelyn cried, pulling away.
Clara's hands flew to her mouth, and Lionel's jaw tightened, his eyes blazing. Lady Beatrice's face remained impassive, but her fingers tightened on her napkin. Diana Prescott leaned forward, her expression a mix of shock and fascination, while Reginald Thorne cleared his throat, his eyes darting nervously. Inspector Hargreaves, who had been lingering near the dining room door, stepped forward, his notebook already open. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, his tone sharp, "who did you meet and why? This is a serious admission." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she held her ground. "I met someone who promised to help us," she said, her voice breaking. "Henry's practice has been struggling, and we were desperate. Langston found out, and he demanded money to keep quiet. I didn't kill him, I swear, but I couldn't keep lying." Dr. Grayson rose, his face ashen. "Evelyn, you have said enough," he said, his voice strained. "Inspector, my wife is overwrought. She doesn't know what she's saying." Miss Marple, her knitting paused, watched the scene unfold with quiet intensity. Evelyn's confession was a crack in the dam, releasing a flood of partial truths. The E.G. in Langston's notebook was indeed Evelyn Grayson, and a midnight meeting suggested a financial motive, or perhaps something more personal. But who had she met, and what was the nature of their agreement? The Pact at midnight loomed larger, a shadow cast across the entire household. Hargreaves pressed Evelyn for details, but she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I won't say more, she whispered. I've said too much already. As the inspector escorted Evelyn and Dr. Grayson to the library for further questioning, the remaining guests erupted into hushed speculation. Diana Prescott's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and accusing. Well, that explains a great deal, she said, her eyes on Clara. Blackmail, secrets. Langston was a vulture, wasn't he? I wonder who else he was squeezing. Clara's face flushed, and she rose, her voice trembling with anger. Stop it, Diana. You've been hinting and sneering since I arrived. If you have something to say it. Diana's smile was cold. Oh, I have plenty to say, Clara. Langston was asking about your past, wasn't he? Liverpool, 1922. Ring any bells? Lionel stepped forward, his fists clenched. That's enough, Diana, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You're not helping. Lady Beatrice intervened, a voice like a whip. This bickering is unseemly. We are all under suspicion. And tearing
Langston, it seems, had a talent for finding those bindings. Her words hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the reactions. Clara's quick intake of breath, Lionel's tightened jaw, Diana's narrowed eyes. The room was a powder keg, and Evelyn's confession had lit a spark. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the clues, the green thread, the cufflink, the notebook, and now Evelyn's admission of blackmail. The French window with its loose latch and scuff mark was a gateway to the truth, and Evelyn's midnight meeting suggested a connection to the arbor where Langston had died. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple approached Inspector Hargreaves, who was scribbling notes in the library. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft, "Mrs. Grayson's confession is most illuminating, but I wonder if you've considered the servant's access to the West Wing. A maid or footman might have seen who she met, or perhaps even carried a message." Hargreaves nodded, his moustache twitching. "We're questioning them again, Miss Marple. Polly, the maid, mentioned seeing a shadow near the window that night, but she couldn't identify it. You've a sharp mind, haven't you?" "Merely an old woman's curiosity," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. But her thoughts were elsewhere, weaving together the threads of the case. Evelyn's confession had shifted the focus, but it was a partial truth, a piece of the puzzle rather than the whole. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen how fear could drive a person to confess just enough to deflect suspicion, and she suspected Evelyn, or someone close to her, was doing just that. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting in her lap, gazing at the darkened gardens. The arbor, the French window, the Pact at midnight, these were the keys to Langston's murder. Someone had killed to protect a secret, and Evelyn's outburst had brought them one step closer to the truth. But whose secret, and at what cost? The Trap. The morning of August 18th, 1925, brought a restless energy to Blackthorn Manor, as if the house itself was straining under the weight of its secrets. The clear skies contrasted sharply with the clouded atmosphere within, where suspicion hung like a fog that refused to lift. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting, observed the guests with her usual quiet intensity, her needles clicking in a steady rhythm that belied the quickness of her thoughts. Evelyn Grayson's confession the previous evening had cracked the facade of civility, and now, with Inspector Hargreaves closing in, the time had come for a more deliberate approach to unmask the truth.
The inspector had spent the morning questioning the servants, particularly Polly, the maid.
Time is shortly after 1 a.m., aligning with Langston's notebook entry about e.g. Miss Marple, however, suspected the shadow might not have been Evelyn herself, but someone using her shawl, or perhaps another figure entirely. The green silk thread, the cufflink, and the crushed rose petal were pieces of a puzzle, but the pact at midnight loomed largest, a promise that had led to murder. By noon, Miss Marple had resolved to apply a gentle pressure of her own. She approached Lady Beatrice, who stood by the library window, her face etched with strain. "Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, "this is a most distressing affair. I wonder if we might gather everyone this afternoon, perhaps for tea in the drawing room. A conversation with all present might clarify certain matters." Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. "A sensible idea, Miss Marple. I'll arrange it for 4 o'clock. The inspector might join us, I presume." "I believe he would find it illuminating," Miss Marple replied, her smile serene, but her mind calculating. A gathering, she knew, could unsettle the guilty, forcing them to reveal what silence had concealed. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how a well-timed question could unravel a lie, and Blackthorn Manor was ripe for such a moment. At 4 o'clock, the guests assembled in the drawing room, their faces a mixture of weariness and wariness. Inspector Hargreaves stood by the fireplace, his notebook in hand, his moustache bristling with purpose. Lady Beatrice presided over the tea tray, her poise unshaken, but her eyes watchful. Clara Wentworth sat beside Lionel Ashford, her hands clasped tightly, her green eyes shadowed. Dr. Henry Grayson and Evelyn sat together, their faces pale, Evelyn's fingers twisting her handkerchief. Diana Prescott's sharp features were taut, her emerald brooch glinting as she surveyed the room. Reginald Thorne, mopping his brow, seemed smaller, his usual bluster subdued. Miss Marple, her knitting in her lap, began with a disarming simplicity. "It occurs to me," she said, her voice mild, "that Mr. Langston's death was not a random act. He was a man who collected secrets, and secrets, as we know, can be dangerous. His notebook mentions a pact at midnight. A most curious phrase. I wonder if anyone here might know what he meant." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Clara's hands tightened, and Lionel's jaw clenched. Evelyn's eyes darted to her husband, who adjusted his spectacles with a trembling hand. Diana's lips parted, as if to speak, but she hesitated, her gaze flicking to Thorne. Hargreaves seized the moment. "Miss Marple raises a good point. Langston's notes also mention Liverpool, 1922, and a hidden beneficiary in the Ashford estate. And then there's Mrs. Grayson's admission of a midnight meeting. Someone in this room knows more than they've told. Let's have it." The pressure worked. Diana
Prescott, her composure cracking, leaned forward, her voice sharp.
"If you want secrets, Inspector, ask Clara about Liverpool. Langston was obsessed with her past, and I heard him say she wasn't who she claimed to be. Isn't that right, Clara?"
Clara's face flushed, and she rose, her voice trembling with anger.
"That's a lie. I told you my family travelled. There's nothing sinister in it. Langston was a gossip, nothing more."
Lionel stood, his hand on her arm. "Leave her alone, Diana. You've been hounding her since we arrived. If anyone had a reason to silence Langston, it was you, your vendetta, as he called it." Diana's eyes blazed. "How dare you? My vendetta, as you call it, was against his lies, not his life. He was digging into everyone's business, yours, Clara's, even Thorne's precious estate papers." Thorne cleared his throat, his face reddening. "Now, see here," he began. But Miss Marple interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "Langston's notes suggest you were evasive about the estate's trust. I wonder if there's a financial matter, a beneficiary perhaps, that he uncovered. Secrets of that sort can weigh heavily, can they not?" Thorne's handkerchief froze mid-mop, and his eyes darted to Lady Beatrice,
I handled the estate's affairs properly, he stammered. Langston was fishing, that's all. There's nothing to it. Lady Beatrice's voice cut through, cold and precise. Enough, Reginald. If there's something to be said, say it now. We cannot continue this charade. The room seemed to hold its breath, and Miss Marple's eyes moved from face to face, noting the cracks in their defences. Evelyn's confession had opened a door, and now the accusations were flying, each guest deflecting suspicion onto another. But it was Dr. Grayson who broke the silence, his voice low and strained. "Very well," he said, rising. "Evelyn told you about the blackmail, but there's more. Langston knew about my financial difficulties. He threatened to expose a loan I took, one that wasn't entirely above board. I met someone in the West Wing that night to discuss repayment, but I didn't kill him." Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Henry, no! You promised we'd keep that quiet." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. Dr. Grayson's admission, like Evelyn's, was a partial truth, a carefully measured revelation. The pact at midnight was beginning to take shape, a financial arrangement perhaps, or a promise to protect a shared secret. But who had been at the meeting, and why had it led to murder? Hargreaves scribbled furiously, his eyes narrowing. "Who did you meet?"
Piercing. "Dr. Grayson, a man is dead. Privacy is a luxury we can no longer afford. Was it someone in this room?" The question hung in the air, and the guests shifted uncomfortably. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and Lionel's hand tightened on her shoulder. Diana's smile was gone, replaced by a wary frown. Thorne's face was a mask of panic, and Lady Beatrice's composure wavered, her fingers clutching her pearls. Hargreaves, sensing the moment, pressed harder. "I want names, Grayson, and I want to know about this pact at midnight. Someone here knows what it means, and I'll not leave until I have the truth." Miss Marple watched, her mind sifting through the clues, the green thread, the cufflink, the notebook, the shadow in the West Wing. The trap had been set, and the guilty party, or parties, were beginning to falter. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how a single question, asked at the right moment, could unravel a lie. Here, in the drawing room of Blackthorn Manor, the truth was close, but it was not yet hers to grasp. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The drawing room of Blackthorn Manor, on the afternoon of August 18, 1925, was a crucible of tension, its elegant furnishings and soft light a stark contrast to the raw emotions simmering among the guests. Miss Jane Marple sat in her corner, her knitting needles silent for once, her bright eyes fixed on the assembled company. The trap she had helped set during the tea-time gathering had shaken the household, and now, with Inspector Hargreaves pressing for answers, the truth behind Victor Langston's murder was poised to emerge. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the very walls of the manor leaned in to hear the unraveling of its secrets. Hargreaves stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, his mustache bristling with determination. The guests, Lady Beatrice, Clara Wentworth, Lionel Ashford, Dr. Henry Grayson, Evelyn Grayson, Diana Prescott, and Reginald Thorne, sat in a tense semicircle, their faces etched with fear, guilt, or defiance. Miss Marple, her hands folded in her lap, spoke first, her voice gentle but carrying the weight of certainty. "It is a curious thing," she began, "how a single act can ripple through a house like this, revealing what lies beneath the surface. Mr. Langston's death was no accident, nor was it the work of a moment's passion. It was a calculated act born of fear and desperation. Shall I explain how I see it?" Hargreaves nodded, his eyes sharp. "Go on, Miss Marple. You've a knack for this, and I'd hear your thoughts." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, lingering on each face. "Let us begin with the clues," she said. "A gold cufflink marked L.A., found near the arbor. A green silk thread on the west wing.
Polly, the maid. These are not random pieces, but parts of a whole." She paused, letting her words settle.
Victor Langston was a blackmailer, as Mrs. Grayson so bravely revealed. He preyed on secrets, and in this house, secrets abound. Let us consider the pact at midnight. It was no mere meeting, but an agreement made in the arbor on the night of August 14, to protect a shared secret. But whose secret? And why did it lead to murder? Clara's hands trembled, and Lionel's jaw tightened. Evelyn Grayson clutched her husband's arm, while Diana Prescott's eyes narrowed. Thorne mopped his brow, his face pale. Lady Beatrice remained still, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "The cufflink points to Captain Ashford, but it was too conveniently placed, as if meant to be found. The green thread could belong to Miss Wentworth's dress, or Mrs. Grayson's shawl, but it suggests someone passed through the French window, perhaps to meet in the arbor. The notebook tells us Langston was probing into Miss Wentworth's past, Dr. Grayson's finances, Mr. Thorne's handling of the estate, and Miss Prescott's vendetta. But the key is the shadow seen by Polly, and Mrs. Grayson's admission of a midnight meeting." She turned to Evelyn. "Mrs. Grayson, you said you met someone in the West Wing to discuss a financial matter. But I believe you were protecting someone, your husband perhaps, or another. The green thread was not from your shawl, but from Miss Wentworth's dress, was it not?" Evelyn gasped, her eyes wide. I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Clara. "Miss Wentworth, you were in the arbor that night with Captain Ashford. I saw you there, arguing on the first day. Langston overheard your conversation. A pact to keep your past hidden. You are not Clara Wentworth, are you? You are Ellen Carver, who fled Liverpool in 1922 after a scandal involving a stolen inheritance." Clara's face drained of color, and she clutched Lionel's hand. "No," she whispered. "That's not true." But Lionel's shoulders slumped, and he spoke, his voice low. "It's true, Miss Marple. Clara, Ellen, is my fiancée. She ran from Liverpool after her brother swindled an estate. She was innocent, but Langston found out and threatened to expose her unless we paid him. We met in the arbor to agree on a plan, to pay him off, to keep her safe." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes softening. "But someone else was there, weren't they? Someone who saw Langston as a threat not just to Clara, but to the entire household. Dr. Grayson, your financial troubles were no secret to Langston, and he was pressing you for money. Mr. Thorne, he questioned your management of the Ashford estate, hinting at a hidden beneficiary, perhaps someone who stood to lose if the beneficiary." Miss Marple's eyes turned to Lady Beatrice. "But there is, isn't there, Lady Beatrice? The estate's trust, as Mr. Thorne knows, has a clause that could redirect funds to a distant relative, Miss Prescott perhaps, if certain conditions are met. Langston discovered this, and his scoop threatened to upend the family's finances. You invited me here, I believe, not for equilibrium, but because you suspected trouble, and when Langston was killed, you knew it was tied to the pact." Lady Beatrice's composure faltered, her hand tightening on her pearls. "Miss Marple, you go too far." "Not far enough," Miss Marple said gently. "The murderer is in this room. It was not Clara nor Lionel, though their secret gave motive. It was not Dr. Grayson or Evelyn, though their desperation was real. It was not Mr. Thorne, whose evasiveness hid only incompetence. It was you, Miss Prescott." Diana's face froze, her emerald brooch glinting as she leaned forward. "That's absurd. I had no reason to kill him." But you did, Miss Marple said. Your vendetta was not just against Clara, but against Langston, who knew you were the hidden beneficiary. You stood to gain a fortune if the estate's trust was renegotiated, but only if Clara and Lionel's engagement failed. Langston's blackmail threatened to expose this, so you acted. You wore Clara's green dress, stolen from her room, to frame her. You dropped Lionel's cufflink, taken during a moment of distraction. You struck Langston in the arbor, where you knew he'd be meeting Clara to collect his payment at 7:15 a.m. Diana's eyes blazed, but her voice shook. You have no proof. The crushed rose petal, Miss Marple said, was from your brooch, caught in the arbor during the struggle. The scuff mark on the window frame matches your shoes, not Clara's. And Polly saw you, not Evelyn, in the West Wing, wearing the dress to create a false trail. You killed Langston to protect your inheritance and to ruin Clara. The room was silent, every eye on Diana. Hargreaves stepped forward, his voice grim. Miss Prescott, you'd better come with me. Diana's composure shattered, and she rose, her voice a snarl. You're wrong. I won't let you ruin me. But as she moved, Hargreaves signaled his constables, who gently restrained her. The guests gasped, Clara burying her face in Lionel's shoulder, Evelyn clinging to her husband. Lady Beatrice's face was a mask of sorrow, but she said nothing. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. It is a sad thing, she said, when greed and fear drive one to such length. Piece together the puzzle, and the murderer was unmasked.
Chapter 11. The Reflection. The evening of August 18th, 1925, descended upon Blackthorn Manor with a quiet that felt almost reverent, as if the house itself were exhaling after the storm of revelation. The drawing-room, where Miss Jane Marple sat with her knitting, was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, its elegance restored now that the shadow of murder had been lifted. The guests, though still shaken, moved with a new lightness, their faces reflecting relief, sorrow, and in some cases, lingering guilt. Diana Prescott had been taken away by Inspector Hargreaves and his constables, her defiant protests fading into the night, leaving the manor to grapple with the aftermath of her crime. Miss Marple, her pale pink shawl nearly complete, sat near the fireplace, her needles clicking softly as she observed the room. Lady Beatrice, ever the gracious hostess, had resumed her role, offering tea and murmured reassurances to the remaining guests. Clara Wentworth, revealed as Ellen Carver, sat close to Lionel Ashford, their hands entwined, their faces pale but resolute. Dr. Henry Grayson and Evelyn sat together, their earlier tension softened by a shared relief, though Evelyn's eyes still held a trace of fear. Reginald Thorne, his florid complexion returning, sipped brandy and muttered about the need to review the estate's papers, his confidence shaken but intact. Inspector Hargreaves, lingering to tie up loose ends, approached Miss Marple, his notebook tucked under his arm. Miss Marple, he said, his moustache twitching with a hint of a smile, I owe you a debt. Your insight turned this case around. I'd have been chasing that cufflink and Miss Wentworth's past for weeks without you. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but her tone was modest. Oh, Inspector, I merely noticed what was there to be seen. People, you know, are much the same everywhere. In my little village of St. Mary Mead, I've seen how secrets fester, and how a single act can reveal them all. Hargreaves nodded, jotting a final note. You've a way of seeing through the fog, that's certain. Care to share how you pieced it together? Miss Marple set down her knitting, her hands folding neatly in her lap. It was a matter of human nature, Inspector, she said. Mr. Langston was a blackmailer, and blackmailers thrive on secrets. His notebook pointed to many: Miss Wentworth's past, Dr. Grayson's debts, Mr. Thorne's mismanagement, Miss Prescott's inheritance. But the pact at midnight was the key. It was not just Clara and Lionel's agreement to pay Langston, but Miss Prescott's realization that her own secret, the hidden clause in the estate's trust, was at risk. She paused, her gaze distant. The clues were small, but telling. The green thread was from Clara's dress, but
Suspect. The cufflink too was a plant. Miss Prescott had access to Lionel's room, perhaps during a moment of distraction at dinner. The crushed rose petal caught in her brooch betrayed her presence in the arbor during the struggle, and the scuff mark on the French window matched her shoes, not Clara's or Evelyn's. She used the west wing to slip out, strike Langston, and return, all to protect her claim to the estate. Lady Beatrice, who had been listening quietly, spoke, her voice soft but heavy. "I suspected trouble when I invited you, Miss Marple. Langston's questions at dinner, his sly manner, they unsettled me. But I never imagined it would come to this." Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "You invited me for equilibrium, Lady Beatrice, and perhaps I brought a little. But secrets, you see, have a way of demanding their due. Miss Prescott's greed led her to murder, but it was her fear of losing everything that drove her hand." Clara, her voice trembling, spoke up. "Miss Marple, I owe you everything. If you hadn't seen through Diana's lies, I'd have been ruined. My past, it's true, I ran from Liverpool, but I never stole anything. My brother did, and I took the blame to protect him." Lionel squeezed her hand, his face resolute. "We'll face it together, Ellen. No more secrets." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes warm. "That is wise, Captain Ashford. Secrets, like weeds, grow best in darkness. Let the light in, and they wither." As the evening drew to a close, the guests began to disperse, their conversations quieter now, their glances softer. Dr. Grayson and Evelyn spoke in low tones, their hands touching lightly, as if rebuilding a fragile trust. Thorne, clutching his brandy, muttered about returning to London, his confidence in his own competence shaken. Lady Beatrice, ever the pillar, thanked Miss Marple with a quiet dignity, her eyes betraying a gratitude she could not fully express. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked into her bag, and prepared to retire. "It is a sad thing," she said to Hargreaves, "how fear and greed can twist the human heart. But it is also a reminder, is it not, that truth has a way of finding its way out?" Hargreaves nodded, his respect evident. "You've a philosopher's mind, Miss Marple. I'll see to it that Miss Prescott faces justice, and I'll not forget your help." Miss Marple smiled, her small figure moving toward the staircase. "Good night, Inspector. I shall return to St. Mary Mead tomorrow, where I dare say the mysteries are smaller but no less human." As she ascended the stairs, the manor seemed to settle, its grandeur restored but its lessons enduring. Miss Marple paused at her bedroom window, gazing out at the moonlit gardens. The arbor, once a place of secrets and death, stood silent, its roses untouched by the night's chill. In her mind, she saw the threads of the case, the cufflink, the thread, the petal, the notebook, woven into a heart's Tapestry of truth. Human nature, she mused, was the same everywhere, whether in a village or a grand estate. And with her little grey cells, she had tended the garden of Blackthorn Manor, rooting out the weeds to let the truth bloom. Chapter 12. The Echoes of Truth. The morning of August 19, 1925, dawned bright over Blackthorn Manor, the Devon sun casting long shadows across the gardens, where only days before Victor Langston's body had lain beneath the yew hedge. The manor, though still grand in its Georgian splendor, seemed to breathe more freely, as if the revelation of Diana Prescott's guilt had lifted a weight from its ancient stones. Miss Jane Marple, preparing to depart for St. Mary Mead, stood at her bedroom window, her small suitcase packed and her pale pink shawl neatly folded. Her bright eyes lingered on the arbor, its roses untouched by the morning dew, and she reflected on the fragility of secrets and the resilience of truth. Downstairs, the household was stirring, though the usual bustle was tempered by a quiet introspection. Lady Beatrice, ever the steadfast hostess, had arranged a modest breakfast, a final gathering before the guests dispersed. Miss Marple descended the staircase, her steps light but deliberate, her mind still sifting through the echoes of the case. Diana's arrest had resolved the murder, but the ripples of her actions, greed, betrayal, and a carefully laid trap had left marks on everyone at Blackthorn Manor. In the breakfast room, the mood was subdued, but not without hope. Clara Wentworth, now openly Ellen Carver, sat beside Lionel Ashford, their hands clasped, their faces showing a tentative resolve. The revelation of Clara's past had been painful, but Lionel's steadfast support had softened its sting. Dr. Henry Grayson and Evelyn sat together, their earlier strain replaced by a cautious tenderness, as if the truth had forced them to confront their own vulnerabilities. Reginald Thorne, his confidence slowly returning, was discussing legal matters with Lady Beatrice, though his frequent throat-clearing betrayed lingering unease. Miss Marple took her place at the table, accepting a cup of tea with her usual courtesy. Lady Beatrice, her navy dress impeccable as always, leaned toward her, her voice low. "Miss Marple, I cannot thank you enough. Your presence here, it was more than equilibrium. You brought clarity where we saw only shadows." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes twinkling. "It was merely a matter of observation, Lady Beatrice. In my village, St. Mary Mead, I have seen how secrets, like weeds, choke the life from those who keep them. Your household is free of one such weed now, though the garden
Unraveled the mystery. The gold cuffling planted to implicate Lionel, the green thread stolen from Clara's dress to frame her, the crushed rose petal caught in Diana's brooch during the fatal struggle, and Langston's notebook with its cryptic notes about Liverpool, financial troubles, and a hidden beneficiary. The pact at midnight had been Clara and Lionel's desperate plan to pay off Langston, but Diana had seized the moment, using their secret to mask her own motive, a fortune tied to the estate's trust, which she stood to gain if Clara's engagement failed. Clara, catching Miss Marple's eye, spoke hesitantly. "Miss Marple, I owe you my future. If you hadn't seen through Diana's lies, I'd have been arrested, and Lionel—" Her voice broke, and Lionel squeezed her hand. "You were innocent, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, "and innocence, though sometimes hidden, has a way of shining through. You and Captain Ashford have a chance now to build something honest, and that is worth more than any secret." Lionel nodded, his military bearing restored. "We'll face the scandal, whatever comes. Ellen's past is behind her, and I'll stand by her." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Dr. Grayson, who had been listening quietly. "And you, Doctor," she said, "have faced your own shadows. Mr. Langston's blackmail was a heavy burden, was it not?" Dr. Grayson adjusted his spectacles, his face weary but resolute. "It was. My practice. I made mistakes, took loans I shouldn't have. Evelyn tried to protect me, meeting with someone to arrange funds. Langston knew, and he pressed us hard. But we're free of him now, thanks to you." Evelyn's eyes were red-rimmed, but she managed a small smile. "I was so afraid, Miss Marple. I thought our lives would be ruined. But you saw the truth." Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking as she resumed her knitting, a signal that her work was nearly done. "Fear is a powerful thing," she said, "but it is truth that sets us free, even when it stings. Miss Prescott's greed led her to murder, but it was her fear of losing her inheritance that drove her hand. In St. Mary Mead,
I have seen such motives before. Small lives, great passions. Here the scale is grander, but the heart is the same.
Reginald Thorne, emboldened by the brandy he'd taken at breakfast, cleared his throat. Miss Marple, I must say, your insight into the estate's trust was uncanny. I assure you, my handling of it was mostly above board, but I'll be reviewing those papers with a finer comb, thanks to you. Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic.
A careful review is always wise, Mr. Thorne. Secrets in ledgers can be as dangerous as those in hearts.
As breakfast concluded, was a moment of panic. But your evidence, the thread, the petal, the cufflink sealed it. She'll face trial. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Justice must take its course, Inspector. I am glad to have been of some small help. With the meal over, Miss Marple prepared to depart. Lady Beatrice accompanied her to the hall, where a motor car waited to take her to the station. You will always have a place at Blackthorn Manor, Lady Beatrice said, her voice warm. You've done more than solve a crime. You've restored our peace. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Peace is a fragile thing, Lady Beatrice, but it grows best in honest soil. Tend your garden well. As the car pulled away, Miss Marple gazed out at the rolling hills, her mind already drifting to St. Mary Mead. Blackthorn Manor had been a puzzle, its pieces scattered across gardens and notebooks, but she had pieced them together with the quiet logic of observation. Human nature, she mused, was the same everywhere. Greed, fear, love, and loyalty, all woven into the tapestry of life. And with her little grey cells, she had ensured the truth, like a rose, bloomed even in the darkest corners. Chapter 13. The Seeds of Renewal. The afternoon of August 19th, 1925, found Blackthorn Manor bathed in a golden light that seemed to promise renewal, as if the sun itself were washing away the stains of the past few days. Miss Jane Marple, her departure delayed by a late train, sat in the conservatory, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on the final rows of her pale pink shawl. The scent of ferns and orchids filled the air, a reminder of life persisting amidst turmoil. From her vantage point, she could see the gardens, where the arbour stood serene, its roses untouched by the tragedy that had unfolded there. Her bright, bird-like eyes missed nothing, and though the mystery of Victor Langston's murder had been solved, she sensed that Blackthorn Manor was not yet at peace. The household was slowly piecing itself together after Diana Prescott's arrest. Lady Beatrice, ever the anchor, had spent the morning in her study, reviewing papers with Reginald Thorne, whose nervous demeanour suggested he was still reeling from the exposure of his mismanagement of the estate's trust. Clara Wentworth, Ellen Carver, as she was now known, remained with Lionel Ashford, their engagement tested but intact. Dr. Henry Grayson and Evelyn had retreated to their room, their conversations hushed but hopeful, as if the truth had given them a chance to rebuild. The manor, though scarred, was beginning to heal, and Miss Marple, with her quiet presence, seemed to guide its recovery.
Reduced in number but not in spirit, spoke in low tones, their words careful but tinged with relief. Clara, seated beside Lionel, broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "Miss Marple," she said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about letting the light in. I've decided to tell the truth, all of it, to the authorities in Liverpool. I didn't steal anything, but I ran to protect my brother. It's time I faced it." Lionel's hand covered hers, his face proud. "And I'll be with her, every step. We'll clear her name properly and start anew." Miss Marple's smile was warm, her eyes twinkling. That is a brave choice, Miss Carver. Truth, though painful, is like a good pruning. It strengthens what remains. You and Captain Ashford have a sturdy foundation now. Lady Beatrice, pouring tea, nodded. You've given us all a lesson, Miss Marple. I confess, I invited you hoping your presence might deter trouble, but you've done far more. The estate's affairs, I'm afraid, need reordering. Mr. Thorne and I have much to discuss. Thorne cleared his throat, his florid face flushing. Indeed, Lady Beatrice, there were oversights in the trust's management, but nothing malicious, I assure you. Langston's probing made me nervous, but I'll set it right. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze gentle but piercing. Oversights can be as harmful as intentions, Mr. Thorne, but a careful hand can mend them, just as a careful eye can see what's hidden. The estate's secrets, I trust, will be safer now. Thorne nodded, chastened, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the hidden beneficiary, creating our capital and frayed, and Lady Beatrice's resolve suggested it would be handled with care. Dr. Grayson, who had been silent, spoke up, his voice steady. Miss Marple, Evelyn and I owe you our gratitude. Langston's blackmail nearly destroyed us, but your clarity, it's given us a chance to start over. I've arranged to settle my debts properly, and Evelyn's agreed to help me rebuild the practice. Evelyn's eyes, though tired, held a spark of hope. I was so afraid, she said. But you saw through it all, the lies, the fear. I'll never forget that. Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile modest. Fear is a heavy burden, Mrs. Grayson, but it lifts when shared. You and your husband have faced yours, and that is no small thing. As the meal ended, Miss Marple took a final walk through the gardens, her steps slow but purposeful. She paused at the arbor, where the crushed rose petal had betrayed Diana's presence. The scene was peaceful now, the dew sparkling on the grass, but Miss Marple's mind revisited the clues, the cufflink, a distraction, the green thread, household's collective secrets, Clara's past, Grayson's debts, Thorne's errors that had created the perfect storm. Returning to the manor, she found Inspector Hargreaves in the hall, his hat in hand. Miss Marple, he said, I'm off to the station with the final reports. Miss Prescott's confession is solid. She admitted to stealing the dress and cufflink to frame Miss Wentworth and Captain Ashford. Your work made all the difference. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. It was merely a matter of noticing, Inspector. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen how small things, a glance, a word, reveal the heart. Blackthorn Manor is no different, only its roses are grander. Hargreaves chuckled, tipping his hat. You're a marvel, Miss Marple. If ever I'm stumped, I'll know where to turn. As the motor car arrived to take her to the station, Miss Marple bid farewell to Lady Beatrice, who clasped her hand warmly. You've left us better than you found us, Lady Beatrice said. That is a rare gift. Miss Marple smiled, stepping into the car. Tend your garden, Lady Beatrice, and it will bloom anew. As the car wound through the Devon hills, Miss Marple gazed out at the passing countryside, her mind already drifting to St. Mary Mead. Blackthorn Manor had been a puzzle, its pieces scattered across gardens and hearts, but she had woven them into a tapestry of truth. Human nature, she mused, was the same everywhere, flawed, fragile, and capable of redemption. And with her little grey cells, she had ensured that Blackthorn Manor could begin again, its secrets laid bare, and its future bright. Chapter 14. The Garden Restored. The late afternoon of August 19th, 1925, cast a serene glow over Blackthorn Manor.
the golden light filtering through the ancient oaks and dappling the rose garden with patterns of hope. The manor, though marked by the tragedy of Victor Langston's murder, seemed to stir with a quiet renewal, as if the truth, so painstakingly uncovered, had cleared the air like a summer rain. Miss Jane Marple, her departure now imminent, sat in the conservatory, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm as she worked the final stitches of her pale pink shawl. Her bright eyes roamed the room, taking in the subtle shifts in the household's demeanor, and she reflected on the delicate balance of human nature, its capacity for deceit and its yearning for redemption. The guests, reduced by Diana Prescott's arrest, had gathered for a final tea, a ritual orchestrated by Lady Beatrice to mark the end of the tumultuous weekend. The conservatory, with its lush ferns and blooming orchids, offered a softer setting than the formal dining room, and the atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. Clara Wentworth, way to a tentative trust. Reginald Thorne, his confidence bolstered by Lady Beatrice's assurance of his continued role, sipped his tea with less nervousness than before. Lady Beatrice, presiding over the tea tray with her customary elegance, caught Miss Marple's eye and smiled. "Miss Marple," she said, "your presence has been a blessing. I had hoped for equilibrium, but you've given us something far greater. A chance to begin anew." Miss Marple's needles paused, her smile gentle. "You are kind, Lady Beatrice. In my village of St. Mary Mead, I've seen how a single truth can change a household, much like a well-timed pruning can save a garden. Your manor is strong, and its roots run deep." Clara, her auburn hair catching the light, spoke hesitantly. "Miss Marple, I've written to the authorities in Liverpool, as I said I would. I'm ready to clear my name, whatever it takes. Lionel and we want to build something honest here at Blackthorn, if Lady Beatrice will have us." Lady Beatrice's expression softened, a rare warmth in her blue eyes. "You are family, Ellen, and Lionel is my nephew. The manor is your home, and we shall face the future together." Lionel nodded, his military bearing restored. "We'll make it right, Aunt Beatrice, and we'll ensure the estate's trust is managed properly. No more secrets." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A wise choice, Captain Ashford. Secrets, like shadows, grow long when left unchecked. But you've chosen the light, and that will serve you well." Dr. Grayson, his spectacles glinting, cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, Evelyn and I have decided to sell part of my practice to settle the debts Langston exploited. It's a fresh start, thanks to you. Your clarity, it showed us what we could be." Evelyn's voice was soft, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I was so afraid of losing everything. But you saw through the lies, not just Diana's, but ours. We're grateful." Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile modest. "Fear is a heavy cloak, Mrs. Grayson, but it falls away when we face the truth. You and your husband have taken the first steps, and that is no small thing." Reginald Thorne, emboldened by the atmosphere, ventured a comment. "I've begun a full audit of the estate's trust, Miss Marple, as you suggested. There were irregularities, but nothing criminal. Diana's claim to the inheritance was a loophole. One will close. Langston's prying nearly undid us, but we're stronger for it." Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but firm. "Careful stewardship, Mr. Thorne, is as vital as careful observation. The estate is in good hands, I trust, now that its secrets are laid bare." As tea concluded, Miss Marple took a final stroll through the gardens, her step slow but purposeful. She paused at the arbor.
Green thread, the crushed rose petal, the notebook had been small but telling, each a thread in the tapestry of truth she had woven. Diana's greed had driven her to murder, but it was the household's collective secrets, Clara's hidden past, the Graysons' debts, Thorne's errors that had created the conditions for her crime. Returning to the manor, Miss Marple found Inspector Hargreaves in the hall, his hat in hand, preparing to depart. "Miss Marple," he said, his moustache twitching with a smile. "Miss Prescott's trial is set, and her confession holds. The evidence you pointed out, the thread, the petal, the cufflink, was airtight. You've a gift, ma'am." Miss Marple's smile was serene. "It is merely a matter of noticing, Inspector. In St. Mary Mead, I've learned that human nature is the same, whether in a cottage or a manor. Greed, fear, love, they shape us all, and they leave traces if one knows where to look." Hargreaves tipped his hat. "If I'm ever in St. Mary Mead, I'll look you up. You've made my job easier, and that's no small feat." As the motor car arrived to take her to the station, Miss Marple bid farewell to Lady Beatrice, who clasped her hand warmly. "You've left a mark on Blackthorn Manor," Lady Beatrice said. "We shall not forget you." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And I shall not forget Blackthorn, Lady Beatrice. Tend your roses, and they will bloom for years to come." As the car wound through the Devon hills, Miss Marple gazed out at the countryside, her mind drifting to St. Mary Mead. Blackthorn Manor had been a garden of secrets, its thorns sharp but its roots strong. With her little grey cells, she had pruned away the deceit, leaving room for truth and renewal. Human nature, she mused, was both frail and resilient, and in its complexities lay the beauty of life. Chapter 15. The Quiet Departure. The evening of August 19th, 1925, draped Blackthorn Manor in a tranquil twilight, the Devon hills glowing with the last embers of the setting sun. The manor, its grandeur softened by the events of the past few days, stood as a testament to resilience, its roses blooming defiantly in the garden where tragedy had struck. Miss Jane Marple, her pale pink shawl, now complete and folded neatly in her suitcase, stood in the grand hall, preparing to depart for St. Mary Mead. Her small figure, clad in a simple grey dress with a cameo brooch, belied the sharp mind that had unravelled the mystery of Victor Langston's murder, restoring peace to a household torn by secrets. And Evelyn, their faces lighter than before, offered tentative smiles, while Reginald Thorne, his florid complexion tempered by humility, clutched a briefcase as if it were a shield against further scrutiny. Lady Beatrice stepped forward, her voice steady but heartfelt. "Miss Marple, words cannot express our gratitude. You came as a guest and left as our salvation. Blackthorn Manor owes you its future." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her smile gentle. "You are too kind, Lady Beatrice. I am merely an old woman who notices things. In my village of St. Mary Mead, I've seen how truth, like a rose, requires care to bloom. Your manor is in good hands now, and its garden will flourish." Clara, her auburn hair catching the lamplight, spoke softly. "Miss Marple, you saved me from a false accusation and gave me the courage to face my past. I've heard from Liverpool. The authorities are willing to review my case. Lionel and I will build a life here, honestly." Lionel nodded, his military bearing softened by emotion. "You've given us a chance, Miss Marple. We'll not waste it." Miss Marple's gaze was warm. "Honesty is a sturdy root, Miss Carver, Captain Ashford. Plant it deeply, and your future will be strong." Dr. Grayson adjusted his spectacles, his voice steady. "Miss Marple, Evelyn and I have begun settling our debts as I promised. Your clarity showed us the way, not just through Langston's blackmail, but through our own fears." Evelyn's hand rested on her husband's arm, her eyes bright. "You saw us, Miss Marple, not just our mistakes, but our hopes. We'll never forget that." Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile modest. "Fear is a shadow, Mrs. Grayson, but it fades in the light of truth. You and your husband have found that light, and it will guide you." Reginald Thorne cleared his throat, his confidence returning but tempered by newfound caution. "Miss Marple, the estate's trust is under review, as you suggested. No more loopholes, no more secrets. Langston's meddling nearly ruined us, but your insight saved the day." Miss Marple's eyes were gentle but piercing. "Careful tending, Mr. Thorne, is as vital as careful observation. The estate will thrive if its stewards are vigilant." As the motorcar waited outside, Lady Beatrice handed Miss Marple a small parcel, a book of pressed flowers from the manor's gardens, a token of gratitude. "A reminder of Blackthorn," she said, "though I suspect you'll carry its memory always." Miss Marple accepted it with a smile. "I shall, Lady Beatrice. Every garden tells a story, and yours is one of resilience." She stepped outside, pausing to glance at the rose garden, where the arbour stood serene, its thorns no longer a threat. The clues, the gold cufflink, the green thread, the crushed rose petal, Langston's notebook, had been small but telling, each a stitch in the tapestry of truth that led to murder. But it was the household's collective secrets, Clara's past, the Graysons' debts, Thorne's errors, that had created the conditions for her crime. Miss Marple's little grey cells had unravelled the knot, revealing not just the murderer, but the humanity beneath. As the car pulled away, Miss Marple gazed out at the rolling Devon hills, their contours softened by twilight. Blackthorn Manor receded into the distance, its lights twinkling like stars against the dusk. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where smaller mysteries awaited, but the lessons were the same. Human nature, she mused, was a garden of contradictions. Greed and generosity, fear and courage, deceit and devotion. With her quiet observation, she had tended Blackthorn's garden, pruning its secrets to let truth bloom. Settling back in her seat, Miss Marple opened the book of pressed flowers, her fingers tracing a rose petal, its edges delicate but enduring. "Life," she murmured to herself, "is much like a rose, beautiful, thorny, and ever in need of care." And with that, she closed her eyes, content to return to her village, where new puzzles, no doubt, were waiting.